The Cutting Edge is really proud and honored to have with us today Evaggelos Vallianatos, who is an interesting throwback to how we found you. We were watching C-SPAN one late night, and you happened to release your latest book, This Land is Their Land, and happened to just be caught up in the very subject matter that you were involved in. Mm-hmm. And it was so compelling that we had to write you and say, you know what, this needs a lot more scrutiny than we might have thought. And you know, the food values in this world and supplying food for populations that are growing in astronomical proportions, the constant pillages to our environment and so on, challenges to our environment and so on, should be met. So I guess all I can say to you is welcome to the Cutting Edge, and we're going to try in this hour's period of time, hopefully, to let people know more about this subject and maybe stimulate their desire to find out more about food quality and really what it is. And so I hate to be mouthy here, but one of the things that we start off with is the fact that back in the 1950s, they used to say, we're running out of food to feed the world. And by 1980, everybody will be, you know, we won't have any more food left. And that was in the 1950s. Now, here we are in the year 2007, and they're saying, well, by the year 2020 or 2030 or 2040, who knows, based on who you follow, say we're going to run out of food again. And now, let's start up with this concept of how close are we to losing to not being able to feed the populations of the world?
I don't think that there's a problem in feeding the world population with the existing amount of land. The problem is slightly different. The problem is that the land resources, the number of farmers raising food are shrinking. The land is there, but the people who control the food, they use all these huge amounts of food for profit primarily, and to feed cattle. This is where most of the food goes, to feed cattle so that very wealthy people can eat very well, while the peasants in Latin America, Africa, and Asia are seeing their land resources diminishing and what they eat becoming scarce.
One of the things that we need to follow that up, because there's what we were taken by when you were talking about this whole issue of the fact that there's a multinational corporate takeover of the land of the world in order to, like you say, to feed the most. It's an economic thing, really. I mean, yeah. You know, you're going to take over all of Africa to feed rich people that go on vacation in Aruba, probably.
Exactly.
But the issue at hand is that really, what kind of a danger are these? Because you didn't explain exactly. Small farmers, okay, versus corporate farmers.
Yes.
Let's get that out on the table and say, if you can clearly explain the difference between, you know, corporate farmers and the small farmers.
Mm-hmm. Well, small farmers, whether you call them family farmers or peasants, have been for millennia raising food. And for millennia, they know how to raise food without really any kind of ecological effect that is very serious.
Are you talking about pesticides? Or?
I am talking about not just pesticides, I'm talking about the killing of birds, the killing of wildlife, the making of the land infertile. You have a fertile land, and if you use all these advanced technologies, huge tractors, pesticides, fertilizers, all the stuff of modern agriculture, then you diminish the fertility of the soil. And because you use massive tractors, so you excavate the land more or less, you mine the land, you have a lot of food fertility just simply goes into the wind and ends up in rivers and thousands of miles away. So that the modern farmers, the so-called modern farmers, in order to keep doing what they're doing, they use extreme amounts of heavy synthetic fertilizers. So that the amount of land that has been in one crop production, say in Minnesota for the last 50 years, is almost like desert. And the only way the crop stays there where it is because of the fertilizers, because they use chemicals that kill everything that is inimical to the survival of this crop. And that is completely unsustainable. So that's one way of looking at the food production. The other one with the peasants or the small family farmers, they care for the land, they love the land. This is where their fathers grew up. This is what they're trying to do, not just to make a living, I mean to make some money, but this is a way of life. So the industrial food production has destroyed that way of life, and they try to become completely global. I mean, they want to cover up the whole earth. In fact, in my opinion, the greatest threat of the land grant of this industrial food production is that they want to control the food supply of the world, in a sense.
But, you know, I mean, they're going to tell you, and they're going to say that, and we even talked to Ann Veneman years ago, a few years ago.
Who's
when she went.
Veneman?
Ann Veneman's the...
she used to be the Secretary
of
Agriculture.
At any rate, Ann Veneman said at the time that, you know, we've been using hybrid grains and wheats and things and learning how to make more strong crops over the years forever. And this is just another one of the steps of making these what do they call them, genetically engineered crops, whether it be corn, wheat, soy, or rice, but we just make them stronger, and so that's just part of the process. What would you say to that?
I would say that Mrs. Veneman did not tell the truth in that case, because genetic engineering is simply you are absolutely unsettle the forms of life, the very fundamental parts of life. They take genes out of a flower and they put it into an animal. They take genes out of an animal, they put it in another animal. This is the sort of thing that for philosophical, particularly ethical reasons, not even the Greek gods, powerful beings, would ever even contemplate to do. Because each one of us has evolved over millennia. And if you unsettle that part of life, then what sort of life do we expect to have in the future?
Okay, we're going to hit on that later here in the program, but I thought we'd just give a little quick bite to everybody about these genetic things before we move on. The issues at hand that you hit on right away were the fact that the corporate farmers come in and they use tremendous fertilizers, pesticides, to control the land. And so tell us how that's done. Give us an example of how that would be done.
Yeah, I spent about 25 years with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Most of those years were in the program that is known as Office of Pesticides programs, where they register. That means they approve these chemicals to be used in the land. So by necessity, I learned quite a bit about these chemicals. I mean, I attended meetings, I read thousands of memos and so on and so on and so on. And I have reached the conclusion that the use of these chemicals to kill a weed or an insect, yes, it's there. But the real reason for these chemicals is for the control of the land. And this is what I mean. If you have a land that is 10,000 acres, you cannot possibly hire enough people to do the work and be still under your command. So what you do is you have a helicopter and you spray and you kill everything that doesn't fit in your imagination. That's how, in other words, it's another way of maintaining the plantation of the 19th century without slave labor.
Okay, that's a sociological argument. We'll get into that in a while, but because there's that. But Larry, why don't you bring up this north-south concept that you mentioned in your book?
Evaggelos, thank you for meeting with us this morning.
Thank you.
In reading your book, you call agriculture a North versus South struggle. Do you feel the South can hold back this invasion?
This is where there is some hope. I mean, we have a hope in North America with the small family farmers and the organic farmers in particular. And the greatest strength actually is in Latin America and Africa, particularly Latin America, because there the globalization has not got to the dimensions that it has reached in this country. So those people resist. Like, let's take example of Mexico. Mexico has corn. It's growing corn because of millennia traditions of corn. This is where corn actually emerged in nature. Yes. So that when you begin to unsettle the foundations of that culture, you unsettle Mexico fundamentally. And those peasants, those campesinos really resist this sort of thing. Indeed, I was at the conference in last September in Mexico City, and I had a chance to talk to people from Oaxaca, the peasants that actually are fighting the struggle to maintain the integrity.
What are they struggling for down there?
They are struggling not to allow the North Americans to import their own corn, which has already been bioengineered, which already is hybrid, and therefore it can contaminate the actual supply of their indigenous corn
I hate to
production.
stop you there, but boy, that's such an important issue. Tell us about how bioengineered corn, what did you just say the word is? Contaminates the indigenous corn.
Well, the corn pollinates. I mean, so that if you change the structure of this plant with another gene, then when the corn pollinates, I mean, when the insects go to pick up the stuff that produces another corn, then they will go to wildlife. They will go to nature, and they're going to transfer that pollen to another plant that should not be, and that new plant will become like the one that has been bioengineered, and that's what I mean by contamination.
So it's like a disease.
It's spread by the wind, and it's almost uncontrollable.
And what happens after that happens?
Then that corn, the pure corn, let's say the Oaxaca corn, becomes contaminated, and therefore you cannot ever trust again that you have the original variety of corn. And it's terrible. I mean, it's not good because you change the structure of the plant, as we said.
One of the issues that we brought up in this is the fact that there's a drop-dead gene within this, the corporate corn or whatever. We were looking at that and seeing, maybe you know the answer whether that's true or not, but once you plant the bioengineered corn, you have to stay buying it every year.
Yeah, it's
and
true.
Why is that? Why would you have to keep buying the same new seed all the time?
Is that an annual seed that you have to keep buying year after year?
Yeah, because the company that owns the seed has a patent, and it forbids you from saving seed so you can actually grow it yourself. It says if you're going to use let's say Monsanto will sell you this seed, you are not supposed to keep enough, like my father used to, for the next growing season. So you have to go back to Monsanto. So that means you suddenly become a client, 100% a client, and dependent for your very life on that company that sells the bioengineered seed.
So before, the traditional part of farming was you saved a little bit of corn to be planted next year.
Of course, yeah.
Which we did, you heard of.
For millennia.
Right?
My father did it, his father did it, and we go back all the way to Hesiod 2,500 years ago.
Now, what kind of crops did your father plant?
My father was growing wheat, lentils, and we also had small flocks of sheep and goat, and therefore from the milk he made cheese, and so we were self-reliant because we had some food, the bread, and we also had olive trees for olive oil, and we had also vines for wine, and he continued that tradition from his father. And unfortunately, what we are saying about this green revolution, or the industrialization of agriculture, that also reached Greece in the 50s and 60s. And now I go back to my village, and there's practically nothing of what I remember as a child.
Right.
Everybody is now using.
We're not against what you're saying. We're just going to give you some challenging thoughts here. They would say that because of the fact that they need larger yields or whatever to feed the population, which you say is not necessary, but I'm just going to throw that out as a precursor, and that they need to add these pesticide controls to the actual seed, which is corn, wheat, rice, or whatever. They have to add these pesticides so that the bugs don't eat the actual crop. Mm-hmm. It seems logical. Why would it not be logical to add pesticides as part of the genetic makeup of a corn seed or a wheat seed or a rice seed or a wheat seed?
Yeah, it would not be logical because people, farmers all over the world did this farming without a drop of chemicals for millennia. So all this chemical stuff is World War II and after kind of development. During World War II, there were one family of chemicals in particular, the organophosphates, that were related to chemical warfare research. So World War II ended without having a chemical warfare. So they had tons of the stuff, so they didn't know what to do with them, so they passed them on to the farms. And so that we still today, at this very moment, our food is sprayed intentionally or unintentionally with some of these molecules.
Because the one that I think they banned was what, DDT?
DDT, that was in 1972.
That was a chlorinated hydrocarbon, they call it. Right?
Yeah, these were related to chlorine. So they made hundreds of chemicals out of chlorine molecules. And of course, these chlorine molecules are extremely toxic, and they stay decades in the environment, decades. So we can still find DDT in the land that used to be used, say, in 1970s.
Is this the same stuff they use for fumigation in homes and stuff?
DDT, yeah, they use it for malaria, they still do, and they still want to revive it. In fact, they use it in Africa, they use it in Mexico. Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Unfortunately, yeah.
Okay,
Unfortunately.
Larry,
You know,
go.
one of the questions, and there's several that we have for you, and I guess perhaps your point is whether or not we're losing our food sovereignty in the nations of the South. Nigeria imports wheat, corn, and rice, yet they use the land to produce cocoa, coffee, sugar, rubber, tobacco, and peanuts. Is this a justifiable trade-off? How do you explain that?
First of all, it's not justifiable, and I explain it by history. That is, when the Europeans went to Africa in the 15th century, they brought with them dogs, cats, wheat, everything that they ate, and they imposed it on the blacks, on the black people of Africa. And they said to them, they wanted to tax them, but they didn't know how to tax them, because the Africans were not capitalists as we have been. So they said, okay, so they chose a few crops which were known as cash crops, like the cocoa bean for chocolate, tea, bananas, all this, and they forced them to use the best amount of land to grow these cash crops. And they exported, of course, this to the capitals of Europe, Belgium, all over, London, Paris, and then eventually to North America. And indeed, this is such a disaster that this is why you have hunger in Africa, because the best land of Africa is used to produce these cash crops, while the African peasant is actually using the worst form of land, and they're using, unfortunately, the European crops, not the African crops.
You know, it's interesting. In your book, you say that 86 nations do not grow enough food to feed themselves, and that there's 800 million chronically undernourished people in the world.
There could well be now 1 billion and more, because this number it's 4 or 5 years ago.
Is this due to Norman Borlaug's Green Revolution? What happened to Bangladesh and Indonesia?
Yeah, you mentioned Norman Borlaug. He was an American agronomist that was sent by the Rockefeller Foundation to Mexico to help Mexico become like California. So he's a very good agronomist, so he went to Mexico and he started his experiments, and eventually developed this short stem wheat that produces more than the other wheat. And eventually, now Mexico is facing the problems that it's facing because of Mr. Borlaug and other scientists. That is the so-called Green Revolution. The side effects of that, of course, is what we have already been talking about. That is the use of chemicals, the contamination of the water, drinking water, the contamination of the land, the killing of the fish in the river. Because each time you spray a chemical and it rains, all the stuff will get into the river, and suddenly you're going to find millions of fish. In fact, when I was teaching in North Carolina, in New Orleans, I remember reading the daily press, and every other week there will be another story about the dead fish floating on the rivers of the Mississippi River.
Let's move on to something that we need to really, it kind of encapsulates the whole global shot, and that is on these trade agreements that we hear so much about. You know, we had NAFTA and CAFTA, and now we've got all of the ones with the European community, and we've been since 2000. Back about 2000, we were going to go to a bioengineering conference in Denmark, but weren't able to make it there. But I guess the question is that this has been a conjecture about this bioengineering and these very seeds that you're talking about from at least 2000 that we know of. How long has it really been going on?
The genetic engineering stuff started in full blast in the 90s. So it's about almost 20 years now by now, and now it's of course flowering, and you have hundreds of, in fact thousands of acres, millions of acres now that are devoted to bioengineer crops. Now the Europeans, of course, they have been more concerned about quality of food than we have been, and they put a moratorium on the introduction or the selling or the purchase of American genetically engineered crops. But now I think they may be waiving the moratorium, and they may be getting back into the bioengineered crops. But nevertheless, the international trade agreements are nothing else but another way for corporations to have another access to these global markets and make more money. And if you look at NAFTA, for instance, you can see the effects after 10, 12 years now. You can see that in Mexico is not any better off. There are more people hungry in Mexico now than there were before. And if you go to Mexico and talk to them, and you see the Mexicans, because of NAFTA, they deleted the clause of their constitution which forbade them to sell the ejido land, that is land that was actually owned together communally in Mexico. They have done away with that provision. So now you can go buy and sell peasant land, and therefore these peasants become landless. And then what do you think they do? They come to California, they go to Texas, and they become the landless migrant farmers, or the slaves that American farmers rent. That's what we have. And this is the lesson I got from Mexico when I was in September of 2006. Those campesinos from Oaxaca said to us, we are very angry with what you're doing. Not only you wreck our quality of food, but you also force us to come and beg in North America. We don't want to come to California.
No one has ever broached this in this manner, Dr. Vallianatos. No one has ever mentioned this way before, and it's an interesting, very interesting concept. So you're saying that because of our impact to the food market in Mexico has actually driven the Mexicans back here to California.
Exactly.
As part of the illegal immigration process.
Yeah, we have a constant source of slaves coming to North America.
It's unbelievable. Okay, listen, we've got to get some issues in here pretty quickly. I've got just a few minutes on this part of the tape. Okay. Let's talk about not only the pesticides and how they're embodied in these corn crops and wheat and rice and soy, but also the actual end result. When the manufacturers make the cereals and so on, they put in preservatives. We're finding more and more preservatives in everything we have. How does that tie in with the crops and with all of this?
Well, it's because you have so few companies controlling so much land, controlling so much of the food supply, that they have to industrialize everything. And therefore, living in Virginia and buying organic food, most of my organic food comes from California. And if you buy anything that is processed, it has to be packaged and fixed with all these preservatives, because you have to have a shelf life of X months before it expires, so that you can sell it all over the world. This, in other words, the trade and the ability to make money and the control of all this food supply by very few create all this necessity to contaminate the world's food supply, and therefore cause all the horrific effects on nature and also the health effects on us.
So what you're talking about really is that's whether it's these giant central warehouses for all the big markets, or whether it's Walmart or Costco's or any of these things, that it's because of the fact they have to. Yeah, we always wondered, why do you have to store so much of this food away and with such long shelf lives? How does that all work?
Because it moves thousands of miles away. It moves by train, by truck, by aircraft. And it has to survive intact, at least in some way, so that I can eat it if I live in Alaska, or if I live in Hawaii, or if I live in Virginia. And this is part of, as we said before, the loss of control. And I mean, these big corporations got rid of millions of American small family farmers. So that if we are in California, if we drive in the Central Valley, we can see the effects of that. We can see the effects of that by seeing nothing, no homes, just a perpetual green. That does not belong to many people, it belongs to one corporation. 600,000 acres, 1 million acres. That is not agriculture, that's a factory.
So it's much like it is in Europe then, where there's giant pieces of land and it all belongs to just one
Yeah,
person.
It's like in the Dark Ages where you had the slaves and the masters. I mean, it's the same thing. Names have changed, the quality has remained the same. In fact, it has become worse. Because now we deal with these pesticides, and we have a horrendous increase of cancer. Where is cancer coming from? We know for a fact, EPA in fact funded studies where they demonstrated that in Iowa, where you have wheat production, and you use certain chemicals, you have not only the farmers, but people who live close to the farmers get the cancer twice the rate that people that live, say, in Minneapolis. So we pay a horrendous price for this form of agriculture.
Now, let me ask you a question. Evaggelos, in your book, you said in the late 80s, 1.4% of large agriculture business produced 30% of our food. Now, I don't know what the number is today, but you also go on to say that in 2000, we gave $23 billion in subsidies to these giant business plantations. Do you feel that's justified today?
Of course not. No, it has never been justified to in a sense, financially support the very corporations caused such a disaster in rural America. I mean, the agribusiness has political implications by wrecking communities. It has ecological implications by killing birds, butterflies, endangered species, and health effects for us by contaminating our food, therefore getting disease. Imagine a mother breastfeeding her baby, and the very milk that this baby eats has dozens and dozens of different toxic chemicals in minute amounts, but this stuff adds up. This is the problem.
Is, though, there's very little in-depth public knowledge of GE or GM products. In fact, when they've been asked, one of the surveys I saw that only 21% of women and 35% of men in the United States support GM foods. I'm going to tell you a story. I went to Russia 4 years ago. We had dinner with a family, professional people in St. Petersburg. And the wife's first question to us is, can you explain and justify to us your GM of food and corn? And it amazed me. We just home for a friendly dinner. We didn't expect to see that. 80% of the people in Russia reject GE food. So it's not necessarily just a North and South. You might say U.S., maybe Argentina, against third world countries.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, when we see reports of scientists, you know, trying to promote the Monsanto products here, what's your experience in the rest of the world?
The scientists, these are corrupt scientists, unfortunately, and this brings me to the point to talk about land-grant universities. The land-grant universities, we have 68 in this country. They were created by President Lincoln with the idea of helping the people's universities to help the farmer to become more productive and to raise their standard of living. This was true for about less than a century, but then starting during World War II and after, these land-grant universities began to get money out of corporations like Monsanto, GM and all this, and they demanded that their scientists put their talent, their energies to the production of this sort of agricultural food that we're talking about. And in the process, they abandoned the small farmer. Indeed, I taught from 203 to 204 at the University of Maryland. I was a visiting professor in a department that was a mixture of agronomists, biologists, chemists, and so on. And I must admit that I was completely taken because my colleagues, with the exception of one professor and myself, would not even use the term family farmer. They were completely devoted to agribusiness and to the management of the ecosystems, as they call it.
Well, that's where the grants money is going to come from. It's not going to be from the family farmer, trust me. But I have to mention something here that the other side's going to mention, and that is that whether it's Dow or Monsanto or ADM, all of those are companies from the international companies from the United States. What about the international companies from Europe and from the Far East?
They follow the same tradition. They are in bed together. They are not competing with each other, in fact. You have $30 billion worth of making money out of selling pesticides. You have X number of billions of selling big tractors. These people they are interlocked. They are not competing with each other.
So it's sort of like an oil cabal in a way. That
exactly, yeah.
Together and rowing the oars the same direction.
Yeah, this is the
There's no reason to really worry about protecting who? The people?
Yeah, it's I call it the agribusiness government complex.
In this country, in this country, Doctor, I have to tell you, we always relied on Dow Chemical and Monsanto. I mean, they even had expositions in wherever it is, in World's Fairs, and they also had it at Disneyland and everything else about taking care of our future and looking out for our future and what was going to happen in the future. So the bottom line is, I guess, who's the oversight on this? Who's supposed to be watching? Weren't you when you were the EPA?
Yeah. The government, in theory, this is what they're supposed to do. But because of the tremendous impact of these corporations, they have corrupted the government itself. This is what I know to some degree, because I was at meetings where we were talking, we meaning the staff at EPA, with representatives of Dow Chemical or other major corporations. And in my complaint to my supervisors was that why don't we invite representatives of the environmental community so they have at least an idea as to the kind of negotiations we're making with them. I didn't think it was an unreasonable request. And yet I was nobody responded to my request, and I never saw an environmentalist when we were talking to these corporations and managing their business.
Let's put that in perspective too. You were there during the Carter, initially during the Carter administration when you first went to EPA?
Yes.
and then you went through the Reagan administration, and then the first Bush administration, and
Clinton and the first.
Clinton, yeah. So you went through Clinton, and then when did you leave them again?
I retired, so to speak, in December 2004.
So it's very recent that you're familiar with what's been going on, and it was right at the pivotal axis of where all of this stuff was coming together. What were you able to do at EPA at the time they were there that held anything back, or you felt that you were able to?
My best service at EPA was simply to inform the community, the outside community, about what was going on. I did talk to members of Congress, their staff, privately, of course, because EPA does not wish anybody working for it to represent itself. I kept writing. I got, of course, always in trouble because of my ideas within the agency. They reprimanded me, they tried to fire me, they did all sorts of things that they do to people who raise questions. I must admit now, fortunately, I had a friend who was a congressman from California, George Brown, and he helped me a couple of times by talking to the administrator to tell his people to leave me alone, because it's like a company. Once you don't voice that company voice, then you're in trouble. They don't, of course, promote you. They try to fire you. They try to give you meaningless work so you can quit. It's just not a good. It's not a democracy. The government is not a democracy. It's like another army.
Evaggelos Vallianatos. You know, we want to know something more about where you came from. Can you step back for just a second and just ask, where were you born, and you don't have to go about all your background, but just tell us how you got to the United States.
Mm-hmm. I was born in 1943 in a tiny little Greek village in the Valsamata, in the island of Kefalonia, the island of Ulysses Odysseus, in the Ionian Sea. I was born during World War II. I don't remember anything of the war, but I grew up and I learned from my mother and sisters and brother. I went to the Methodist school in the village and high school, and then my brother had already left for this country. When he came to go to college, he said to me, if you don't want to burden your father with the money, come to the US and you can help me and you can work for me. He had a small restaurant in Chicago, and this is exactly what I did. So I went to the University of Illinois in 1961 when I got here, and I was working in the restaurant in the evenings. And eventually I ended up in graduate school and studied zoology, and then a doctor's degree in Greek history, and did postdoctoral at Harvard in the history of science. And eventually I found my first job in Washington, D.C. With the Office of Technology Assessment because of a book I had already published called Fear in the Countryside, where it brought me to Latin America.
What was the name of that book again?
Fear in the Countryside, the control of agricultural resources in the poor countries by non-peasant elites. This is the book that started.
And what year was this?
It was published exactly 31 years ago, 1976. 1976. It was my first book.
And your response to that from?
That book, according to the publisher, did very well, but I made no money out of the book because the people who funded me to write the book wanted to suppress that book, and they negotiated with my publisher and eventually got all the royalties. And
there you go.
But the book did very well.
Okay.
But that book set the path of my life in this direction, in the direction
Wonderful.
of having concern for the environment and agriculture.
And then up to the modern days when you wrote your current book, which is called This Land is Their Land.
Yes.
When was that published?
That was published last year in March of 2006.
And how does that vary greatly from your original work in 1975?
It, in a sense, confirms some of the original ideas I spoke about: who controls the land, about agrarian reform. And in this new book, I pretty much summarize my 30-year experience in observing things and in working for the government, and bringing all this together and reaching certain conclusions. One of which is that this agribusiness is depopulating rural America, is destroying our democratic traditions, and it's actually contaminating our food supply, and it's making life less enjoyable.
Okay, this is a pretty strong indictment of what's going on, and we're gonna kind of switch gears here to some new issues.
Yes.
That as the modern days moved ahead, that you didn't probably have to face back in 1976. One of them was the cloning of cattle. Another one was the feeding of cattle with engineered or modified, bioengineered or modified feed groups, so like corn or what have you. So tell us, what are the effects on the cattle and on the various, whether it's the chicken or the hogs or whatever?
Yeah, first of all, the very creation of this establishments, these factories, animal farms, it's against science, it's against ethics, and it's against the ecology of the land. It's because you put too many animals very close to each other so that you propagate disease, without a doubt about that. So to prevent that, you have to feed the animals with antibiotics. With the feed itself has to be drenched with all sorts of chemicals to prevent the animals from dying from disease. And that's the food, that's the feed, that is the meat that people eat. Number two, the animals, the cattle, the waste. We deal with that problem, we don't know what to do with it. The government is not forcing the people that own these factories to clean up the waste before it reaches into the rivers and our drinking water by going into the groundwater. So that we create entirely almost new communities, new cities, without any kind of sewage disposal system. That's the equivalent of having these factories in California, in Iowa, in Nebraska, or whoever they may be. And then the other question is that you suggested, the feeding these animals bioengineered food. Now, we don't have very many studies that make the cause and effect connection between health effects and the feeding of this stuff. But logically speaking, it must have some kind of effect. And there's a person named Smith who has written a book, Jeff Smith,
Right.
The Seeds of Deception, where he summarizes all the published evidence from England and the U.S. And he's certain, at least, he's committing, he's making a point that there are direct health effects in eating either animals that have been fed this contaminated, this bioengineered food, or eating crops that have been bioengineered directly, as soybeans, as wheat, as corn in our food supply.
Well, whether it's an indictment or not, it's something probably worth seeking further study about and following up on, even if a modicum of that is true. The second thing is that explain what happens when these you feed some. Here's where I'm going with this. Is bioengineered crops are made with this pesticide. They're designed to kill weeds, maybe, or not to be there, and they turn in. They might every year they have to get stronger. They have to put more of this pesticide into the bioengineered thing because it keeps getting what's the word? Immune?
You're talking about the resistance. The
Correct.
insects and nature in general resist this sort of attack. Because that is actually an attack against nature, the integrity of nature. So the beetle that you're trying to kill becomes immune. It detoxifies the stuff that envelops it, and then you have to double the amount, or increase the amount, or add other chemicals. And so that we face this perpetual struggle. We have our scientists doing their own science in order to discover new weapons to kill something that we should respect. Because in nature, there's always a balance. In other words, when you grow a crop, you're going to have insects that eat other insects. And they create the kind of balance that allows you to grow wheat or corn or soybeans without a drop of chemicals. And the evidence for that, as we speak right now, is the organic farmers. The organic farmers grow everything that is certified organic without these synthetic chemicals. So there's no problem about starving to death or not being able to raise crops. And in addition to that, as we already mentioned, traditionally speaking, peasants and family farmers have known for millennia how to grow food without using any synthetic
Now, when you
crops.
say that, I want to clear that up, because that's one of the things that we actually started this conversation with. And
Yes.
that was about crop yields, the yield per acre.
Yes.
And number two is the crop rotation that normally used to happen in the old days. You used to plant wheat one. I'm not a farmer, so excuse my ignorance.
No, that's true.
But in one case, you may plant wheat one year, then you may plant soy the next year or whatever.
Right.
I don't know what the crop rotation is, but what it does is it replenishes each one of the land with a different chemical the next year, or a natural chemical.
Correct.
And so why aren't we doing that?
We are not doing it again because the farmers, that is the industrial farmers, under the tremendous pressure they actually are to produce more and more in order to sell them, because the government has, as we said, has withdrawn from protecting the environment, has withdrawn from protecting the family farmer, And the only way that the larger fish can eat the smaller fish is to produce enough, so much of soybeans, for instance, so that the price will drop to such a level so that the small guy would not be able to make a living. He will get out of agriculture, and the big guy will grab his land and become even bigger.
This even happened in apples up in Washington State, where there were very many apple farmers, and now there's not so many. There's more industrial apple farmers because they drove them out.
Yeah, this is a cannibalism. They have institutionalized cannibalism in agriculture.
Well, tell us about these super weeds too. One more thing.
What happens in nature, either weed or insect, they have the ability, nature is fighting back, to resist. So they call it, the scientists call it insect resistance or weed resistance. And they develop stronger chemicals, either herbicides against the weeds or insecticides against the insect, to fight what something is part of nature. And if they had followed the organic method or the non-chemical method, then they would import an insect if it did not exist in the area, as they have been doing it at the University of California, for instance. There's still a discipline called biological control, where they import an insect from Malaysia to California to kill this insect that's causing tremendous trouble. And we have had a tradition of scientists and science in fighting this without using the chemicals, without hurting nature. And in fact, California, the University of California, Berkeley, you have had a tremendous tradition in this discipline. And I know well enough the work of a person that no longer is alive, but he was a tremendous scientist, Robert van den Bosch, who wrote in 1978 a great book called The Pesticide Conspiracy. And what this gentleman did, because he knew the scientists and science and universities from within, he wrote about the intimate corrupt relationships between university scientists and chemical companies, how they got paid in order to do certain testing of their chemicals, whether they were efficacious, so to speak. And Robert van den Bosch, in that book, simply continued the story that Rachel Carson started in '62.
Now, who's Rachel Carson?
Rachel Carson was a government biologist who wrote a classic work of Silent Spring in 1962, where she talked about the drenching of nature with all these chemicals. And her style was so beautiful, and the story was so provocative that the book became a bestseller, and it continues to be a bestseller. But what Rachel did not do, she did not make the political connection of all this horror. And it was Robert van den Bosch from the University of California, Berkeley, that made the connection in 1978. And his book is complementary with Rachel Carson's book, so that people that read those two books get a complete picture as to why we have been in this crisis, which I think is absolutely a tragedy.
One of the things that we've found in our research is that a lot of people just think we're just alarmists. They just think we're overreacting, and they think that we don't have we used to play in the mud when we were little kids, and we used to step in dog poo-poo when we were playing around, and some of the kids even threw dog poo-poo on other kids. And nobody had any diseases or anything else growing up, and even grew up very healthy. So there's a real community of people who think we're just overreacting to this problem, or if they don't even believe there is a problem.
Yes.
So what do you say to those people?
I say to them that at least from my small angle, I have 30 years of experience in studying this problem from within and without. And it just seems to me it's not alarmist at all. That is, this sort of stories I have been telling and other people's telling, Rachel Carson, Robert van den Bosch. They can go read Epstein, Samuel Epstein, a professor of medicine at the University of Illinois, who has published repeatedly several books about cancer. In fact, his latest is called The Cancer Gate, where he talks about the politics of cancer. And they can find out that we are going through a kind of epidemic of cancer. This disease is not coming out of nothing. It's coming because of the pressure we put that comes to us, in the environment, through our food supply, through drinking of water. Consider the people living in the state of Iowa. Almost 90% of that state is corn and soybeans. No matter where you are in Iowa, you're going to get zapped by these chemicals, because when a helicopter sprays the chemicals, 99% of that chemical volatilizes. That means it becomes gas. It gets up in the air, and then the air kind of moves it along hundreds of miles, and then it drops down. It drops down in the form of rain, fog, snow. So no matter where you are, you're going to actually be exposed. So this is another threat to organic farming, in fact. Because an organic,
sort of a mini Chernobyl.
The organic farmer cannot find a place that is secure to grow his food certified organic. So that if you were to test an organic tomato and a conventional tomato, in the organic tomato you're going to find a few pesticides, and in the conventional you're going to find probably dozens and dozens of chemicals.
That was another issue that came up that we had the question about was somebody can label their food as organic but actually use bioengineered seeds.
No.
No, now they
The
can't do that?
organic food production forbids three things.
Okay.
Sludge,
Good.
bioengineered foods,
What is that?
bioengineered foods.
Okay.
Bioengineering, genetic engineering is
We
forbidden.
can't say that enough. Bioengineered foods are
it's
not allowed.
forbidden in genetic, in
Okay.
organic.
Can't use those seeds at all.
And then the third thing that is prohibited is any kind of zapping of the food with any
Radiation.
radiation. Yeah,
And
all
that
this.
is another big one is our food, our beef is being irradiated, our fish are being radiated. Tell us about the irradiation process. You were at EPA during that whole process.
Yeah. Radiation is another form of, again, unsettling the structure of food, because the X-rays go through and they move molecules from one point to the other. Some people theorize that you create toxins when you do that, and it certainly, from the X-rays as we know, I mean, we don't want to X-ray what we eat, and so there are medical problems with killing.
And wasn't the
foods.
reasoning for the radiation because it was to kill the E. coli? Wasn't that the desire that's the reason why they said it was necessary to do the radiation?
Yeah, they do that because this is just a little excuse to allow the big or the farmers to do exactly what they do. You see, because of the corruption that we spoke briefly about in Land-Grant University, all the scientists, or rather most of the scientists, they always struggle to find tiny little solutions, so that the big farmer in the Central Valley, for instance, that grows lentils or grows vegetables for acres and acres and acres and acres, and therefore some of the water that gets to irrigate may be contaminated with all sorts of bacteria. In order to protect that company to keep doing what they're doing, they say, okay, take that vegetable and zap it with X-rays, and therefore this man can continue to do what he's doing. He's not addressing the root problem, which is the size of the farm.
Right.
Evaggelos, let me ask you a question, because in your book, you mentioned the dead zone in the Gulf.
Yes.
I mean, this isn't theoretical. This is something that there's facts to back it
It's
up.
absolutely
Can
real.
you share with our viewers
Yeah.
what that dead zone is? and how it came to
I was
be?
at the University of New Orleans, and as a result, I was extremely interested in the whole area, so I investigated on my own with my students. And what is happening is this. You have the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River drains 47% of this country. 47%. And that means hundreds of thousands of tons of stuff coming out of animal farms, pesticides, stuff coming out of other factories, and all of them end up into the Mississippi River, into the Gulf of Mexico. And where they get into the water, including all the fertilizers, of course, they create all sorts of things that eat up the oxygen. And by diminishing the oxygen, of course, life dies. That's why they call them dead zone. So fish, everything dies in that zone. And there is an area the size of almost New Jersey in front of the state of Louisiana and Texas. All that area, most of that area, is actually a dead zone.
How large was this dead zone, let's say, 30 years ago?
I really cannot answer that question, but I do know what the people who are experts, they say the size of these dead zones and the frequency of dead zones is actually increasing. The more stuff gets into the water, the more oxygen less water you have, therefore dead zones.
Let me ask you one last question. This past year, we've had a lot of discussion about ethanol, which really raises a unique situation here, especially in Mexico with growth of corn. And only in the dictionary does energy or ethanol come before food. So here we are, people that are starving around the world, yet we're more concerned now about keeping our ability to keep our cars running. So we're going to be, who knows how many hectares are going to be used for growing the corn for ethanol. In that case, does it matter if it's GM or not? We're not going to consume it. So what's the danger?
Well, first of all, I would say this idea of converting food into fuel is completely illusionary. You're not going to create any more gasoline for us by diminishing, taking 1 million acres of corn and putting it into factories to create stuff for cars. It's again another way of avoiding the real problem. The real problem, of course, is that for 100 years we have diminished the opportunities for public transport. We have not used the technologies we have already known about creating a pollution-free automobile. Indeed, I remember in 1975 the Volvo company was advertising that they had an engine for 80 miles to a gallon. This is 30 years ago.
30 years ago.
Yeah, exactly what happened to that idea. So that means there must be some kind of, if not a conspiracy, at least certainly an agreement among the major oil companies, car companies, to keep the system as is, because it's extremely profitable to them.
Let's look at the oversight here, and one of the things that is so important about this is you were the EPA, and then we have Department of Agriculture, and then we have the Food and Drug Administration. How do those three, if it was a perfect world, how would those three work together to correct many of these problems that you're talking about? How would it work?
They would cooperate, number one, and they would exclude. They would never meet with these private companies alone. They should include the public, and they should reread and enforce the laws that already are in the books. They do not enforce the books on the laws that we have already passed. And number two, if there's a chance for a new legislation, they should not allow the polluters to write the law, because this is what has happened, unfortunately. From the very creation of that agency, the US EPA, for instance, it was destined to fail because the laws for the EPA were written by the very polluters. The pesticide companies wrote the pesticide law. The FDA, the drug companies did the writing of the law, and so on. But if they were to work together, and they would allow to enforce even the laws on the books, then we would be better protected, and the message would be strong enough that henceforth public health should be number one priority.
Let's answer some common sense questions for the people out there that want to go to their market and buy the correct thing. And you know, we're all live in a very busy world, and we have to look at a lot of labels and try to figure out what in the heck is right and what is wrong. What we've noticed, however, though, if you go to a market in Europe or out of this country, you can smell tomatoes. You actually have a smell. The lettuce actually has a flavor. A variety of other things that we don't get in this country. Why is there a difference between, let's say, your native Greece, or when you go back to visit and you can smell all of these different aromas in vegetables and in meat and everything else in fish that you don't get in this country? Why aren't they there? Because
in Europe, for instance, they still have 7% of the population raising food, and here in this country we have 0.1% of raising food. 98% of all the food that we have in this country right now is coming through these factories, these conventional agriculture, agribusinesses,
right.
While 6% of the farmers in Austria, in Germany, in Europe, in Italy are raising food. And you're right, it's not just the smell, but it's also the taste.
Correct.
I mean, a Greek salad, when I go to you can actually taste the difference.
Of course.
And that is what we need. We need to do here is we have to increase the number of farmers we have. The organic farmers are growing by 20% per year, but we need to encourage them. We need to fund them. Take the $23 billion we give to agribusiness and give it to small farmers. People that have, say, for instance, less than 20 acres. We should support them, and we should cut off all support to the large producers. It's this kind of unethical, kind of corporate, plutocratic mentality that is destroying this country. And it's destroying it because we give huge amounts of money and support to people that don't need it. I mean, so we're becoming an undemocratic society. And me being as a historian, I look back to the Roman times and say, wait a moment, this country looks to me like a 4th century AD Roman Empire. And during that time, in the Roman Empire, when you have a republic, number one, when you have a republic like the Athenian Republic, you have limitations on the amount of land that the farmer can grow. If you read Plato in his laws, he says the larger farmer should never be more than 4 times larger than the smaller farmer. Let's assume the Athenian peasant had 1 acre. The largest number of farm would be 4 acres.
One of the issues I wanted to, I know we've got a lot to cover in a very, very short period of time, but on the preservative issues, so BHT, BHA, some of the other preservatives that are added to our food here in the United States that are not added in Europe. Why is that? How has that happened again?
in the United States.
Yeah, we get a lot of preservatives in our country, and they don't have. Is it just pure storage problem? Is that the reason why? It's such a tremendous distribution network that they have to pursue that they can't get the food out in time before it goes bad.
The country is huge, and this food carries. I mean, travels huge distances, and therefore they have to preserve it for long periods of time. I mean, I don't know of any other reason why they do that. I mean, I live in Virginia and I buy stuff from California.
Is there any difference? Are we just kidding ourselves? Ann Miniman said to do this back at the old Department of Agriculture secretary. She said, well, just go get your food at Trader Joe's or at Bristol Farms or at Mother's Kitchen or somewhere else. Those are just local retail outlets for us that are supposed to offer either organic or better types of foods, better quality food. Is that good advice for people?
Not. I mean, my suggestion is that we should buy local. We should eat local food, and avoid as much as possible imported food. The whole idea of having Trader Joe, it's good. I mean, they're probably doing a good job. They're a good company, but they don't belong to the whole country. Why should I buy stuff from Trader Joe's in Virginia? I want to have the local Virginia farmers producing the apples and the cheese and the milk and everything else that I need. I go there and I always complain to these companies when I get in, and I say, why would you bring organic bread from California? I mean, I love California. But why can't they have Virginia people produce the organic food?
And one last thing that's fairly important. You have large companies like Kellogg's, General Mills, some of the big cereal producers. They distribute in South America, they distribute in Europe, they distribute in Mexico, Canada, wherever. But what goes into their packaging? The Kellogg's Rice Krispies or Corn Flakes are different in the United States than they are in Europe or in South America. How is and you see, because we get that preservative deal here in the United States where they don't get it in those other countries.
In Europe, it's because of the domestic laws. The Europeans don't want certain things, so therefore the company that works in Europe would know we have to abide by that law. And this is one, at least, great hope is that the European Union, because they have slightly more conscious about the issues that we're talking about the environment, is that American companies that work in Europe, they have to follow the European law, and therefore, by necessity, they will have to treat us equally.
Now we know that all these mega companies, all these multinationals, have billions and billions and billions of dollars in annual income, and it's very simple for them to buy into any political campaign or any political process that they want to. How do we change that? What would be just a modicum of a change to make it safer?
I would vote for people that follow a different policy. I mean, we really need to start at the local level, and the people who elect in office, we ought to quiz them, we ought to ask them these very questions. Who are you going to support? I mean, at the local level and at the national level, at the state level and federal level, we have to change the perspective of what is the purpose of life and how we can support the democracy and so on. Unless the politicians we elect in office are conscious and responsible to support something that is good for this country rather than for corporations, then none of what we are talking about will make a difference. But we can start also at the local level, in fact at the primary school level. We can demand that they buy organic food at the school level. We can demand that our state offices, when they have cafeterias, actually buy from a small family farmer.
And what about the labeling? Labeling. Should we demand labeling?
Absolutely, yeah. I don't want to eat bioengineered food. I don't want to eat pesticides. So that's why I have chosen to be spending almost double the amount of money for what I eat, and I buy entirely organic.
Right.
If something is not certified organic, I will not buy it.
There is some good news. In Saturday's LA Times, there was a quote from our state senator, Dean Flores, and this had to deal with the E. coli outbreak in the Central Valley. And he's saying, and I'm going to quote, "We want to give consumers confidence that what goes from the farm to the fork is governed by some very strict laws," close quote. And he's right on with that.
Yes.
It's not to panic people, but I think we need to go into it with our eyes open, realizing that the stuff we buy on our shelf.
We need you to plug your book.
Tell us about your book.
So just just raise it up. Just raise it up. I'll tell you. Oh, that's quite nice. Everybody will really see that really well. At any rate, thank you very much. You put that down. But anyway, we were so taken by it. It's the upgrade to your 1976 initial work, basically, is what you're telling us. Tells you the latest stuff of what's going on, and we also, you know, first of all, we have to tell you, it took us over 2 years to find somebody who was willing to be forthcoming about this issue. I'm not joking. It is that this is not an issue that people like to talk about, and we know that you're one of the bravest men on the planet, and we appreciate your honesty and your ability to step up to the plate and to answer some of these questions, even in a temporal way. A very wonderful thing, and we can't thank you enough on the cutting edge for doing that and showing up with us.
Pleasure.
And thank you so much.
Thank you very much.